You think you know what Avatar, Fire and Ash is about. You read the reviews. 70% on Rotten Tomatoes, critics calling it repetitive, more of the same, beautiful but hollow. Audiences debating whether the third film in James Cameron's franchise managed to justify its 3-hour, 15-minute runtime. Fans defending it against what they called lazy critical consensus. The cultural conversation circling around the same 3 points. The visuals are stunning, the family dynamics are moving, and the Ashclan antagonists are undercooked. You watch the film. You saw the grief threading through every relationship. Jake carrying the weight of Nedium's death, Neytiri fractured and furious, Loke searching for something he can't name, Spider caught between two identities, Kiri doing things with Eywa's network that nobody fully understands. You watch the big action sequences. You watch Quaritch in his new avatar body, more dangerous than ever. You watched a tribe of fire-wielding Na'vi terrorize other clans under the ruthless leadership of a woman named Varang. And you probably thought, okay, family survives, villain loses, Pandora is saved, Cameron has done this twice already, he's done it again. Beautifully, yes. With more emotional depth than critics are giving him credit for, yes. But structurally, thematically, this is Avatar. This is what Avatar is. Everyone thinks Avatar, Fire and Ash is a family survival film with a grief motif. That's the consensus. That's the polite way critics described it while shrugging at its Rotten Tomatoes score. Everyone is wrong. Here's what Fire and Ash is actually doing. Here's the argument hiding in plain sight behind 3 hours and 15 minutes of bioluminescent spectacle and ecological action choreography. Here's the thesis Cameron embedded, deliberately or instinctively, it doesn't matter which, into what looks like a franchise sequel. Avatar, Fire and Ash is a horror film about what happens to God's abandoned children, not the Sully family. Not the RDA, not even Quaritch, who functions essentially as a force of nature with a personal grudge. The film's true subject, the thing Cameron keeps returning to, the engine driving everything from the opening frames to the devastating implications of Spider's mycelium-induced transformation, is divine abandonment, what it means to pray and receive silence. What it does to a community of believers when the goddess they've organized their entire civilization around simply doesn't show up. What fills the void where faith used to live? What gets built on the ruins of devotion? The Ashclan, the Mangquan, lost their home tree to a volcanic eruption. That's the bare biographical fact. Before the events of this film, they were Na'vi like any other. They bonded with the land, they tended the network, they connected their neural cues to the trees, to the animals, to the vast biological computer that is Eywa, the goddess, the great mother, the consciousness underlying all life on Pandora. They prayed, they maintained the balance, they did everything right, and then the volcano came, and the fire came, and the home tree burned. And the forest burned, and the sacred land burned, and their family members burned, and through all of it, through the ash and the ruin and the silence, Eywa did not answer. Not a word, not a sign, not a single bioluminescent flicker of response from the goddess to whom they had pledged their entire spiritual lives. Varang rose in that silence. She guided her people out of famine and despair. She refused to let them die in the ruins of their former faith. And she did something radical, something that the Sully family and their allies treat as monstrous, something critics describe as villainy, something the film's surface narrative frames as the antagonist's defining crime, she concluded, rationally, based on available evidence that Eywa either couldn't help or wouldn't help, and that her people needed to stop waiting for a salvation that was never coming. That is not a villain's origin story. That is a theological crisis. Watch what the film actually does with this premise. Critics focused on the action set pieces, the fire tribe raids, the aerial battles, the confrontations between Quaritch and the Sully family. They missed the ideological war at the film's heart. This isn't a movie where the good Na'vi who trust Eywa fight the bad Na'vi who don't. That's the surface reading. That's what the franchise's marketing wants you to think. That's the safe, comfortable interpretation that turns a genuinely disturbing film into a conventional good versus evil fantasy. The real movie is asking something much harder. Is Eywa fair? And the answer Cameron gives, not explicitly, not in dialogue, but in the architecture of the film, in who suffers and how, in what gets resolved and what doesn't, in the terrifying implications of Spider's biological transformation, is no. Eywa is not fair. Eywa chooses favorites. Eywa responds to some prayers and ignores others. Eywa allowed a community of devout believers to be consumed by fire and ash while offering no response, no intervention, no comfort. And then, when those same believers responded to Eywa's silence by turning to a different power, by constructing an alternative theology out of fire and grief and survival, Eywa's chosen warriors march against them and call their alternative theology evil. You probably think this is a stretch. You're probably thinking, Cameron isn't doing theology, he's doing spectacle, he's doing family drama, he's doing environmental metaphor. This is science fiction, not religious philosophy. Here's what you're missing. Cameron has been doing theology across all three Avatar films. He just wrapped it in technology so beautiful that people stopped paying attention to the argument underneath. The original Avatar positioned Eywa as an unambiguous moral authority. The planetary neural network, the interconnected consciousness of all life, the very definition of ecological wisdom. The Way of Water deepened that positioning, adding ritual, prayer, specific spiritual relationships, and the devastating weight of what it means to lose connection with that consciousness. And Fire and Ash, the third film, is where the cracks in that theology become visible. Because Fire and Ash introduces, for the first time in the franchise, Na'vi who have a legitimate grievance against Eywa, not Na'vi who are simply corrupt or power-hungry or seduced by human technology. Na'vi who prayed to the goddess, maintained the sacred balance, did everything required of devout practitioners, and got a volcanic eruption as their answer. The Mongquan's abandonment is not a flaw in Cameron's world-building. It's not an accident. It's not a gap in the mythology. It's the film's most radical thesis statement, delivered in visual language so clear that once you see it, you can't unsee it. Here's the proof. Let me show you what everyone overlooks. When Varang declares, "Your goddess has no dominion here," a line that critics filed under villain exposition, she isn't issuing a battle cry. She's making a factual observation. In the volcanic wasteland where the Mangquan live, Eywa's network is genuinely weakened, possibly absent altogether. This isn't metaphor. This isn't ideology. The goddess actually does not operate in this territory. The bioluminescent network, the physical infrastructure of Eywa's consciousness, doesn't extend into scorched earth. Varang isn't rejecting a deity who rejected her. She's describing the reality of living in a place that God forgot. And now, watch what the film does with the Sully family alongside this. Kiri, the daughter with a direct, personal, messianic relationship with Eywa, the girl who calls her mother in a way no other Na'vi does, is right there, the chosen one, the favored daughter of the planetary consciousness, standing alongside a tribe of Na'vi who knelt in prayer while their world burned and received nothing. The contrast isn't incidental, it's the film's cruelest argument. Some people get Kiri's Eywa, and some people get the volcano. Neytiri's rejection of Spider, a human boy she and Jake adopted who grew up among the Na'vi, who loves Pandora as deeply as any Na'vi born, mirrors this structure with surgical precision. Neytiri, traumatized by grief, decides that Spider's human heritage makes him a threat, a liability, someone she cannot trust. She cuts the bond. She chooses her biological children over her adopted one. She makes exactly the same calculation that she accuses the RDA of making about the Na'vi. Some lives matter more. Some connections are too inconvenient to maintain under pressure. Some people are simply too human to be worth the risk. This isn't about Neytiri's individual failing. This is Cameron building a mirror. Neytiri is doing to Spider what Eywa did to the Monquan. She is the goddess at a smaller scale, making the same choice, and the film doesn't let her off the hook for it. That choice generates some of the film's most painful, dramatic tension. Because we know Neytiri is wrong, we know Spider is loyal, we know the abandonment is unjust, we feel it in our bones. And then why? Why? Why do we not feel the same thing when Eywa makes the same calculation on a planetary scale? That's the question. That's what Fire and Ash is actually asking. This interpretation matters for several reasons. It matters because it reframes the entire moral landscape of the Avatar franchise. It matters because it transforms Varang from a CGI antagonist into one of the most theologically complex characters Cameron has ever written. It matters because it connects directly to one of the most urgent cultural questions of this particular moment in history, a question about what we owe to communities that institutions have failed, about what happens to faith when it goes unanswered, about whether the frameworks we use to organize meaning are as just as we've been promised. But most importantly, it matters because it changes what you're watching. Once you see Fire and Ash as a film about divine abandonment, once you understand that the Ashclan story is the film's moral spine, not its dramatic obstacle, the 3 hours and 15 minutes stops being more of the same and starts being something genuinely disturbing, something that gets under your skin, something that follows you out of the theater. Critics said the film is repetitive. They're right, but not in the way they mean. The repetition is deliberate. It's structural theology. The same story keeps cycling. Community prays, community suffers, community searches for meaning in the aftermath. The franchise has told this story 3 times now from 3 different perspectives, and Fire and Ash is the version where the prayer definitively goes unanswered, where the community's response to that silence is judged as evil, and where the audience is asked to question whether their judgment is fair. Here's what people miss. The Ash Clan is not the villain of Avatar, Fire and Ash. Eywa is, and the film knows it. In the next section, I'll show you the evidence, scene by scene, detail by detail, moment by moment. I'll show you how Cameron built this theological horror film inside the franchise sequel, how he used Spider's mycelium transformation to make his most disturbing argument about faith, biology, and who Pandora truly belongs to, how he deployed Loke's quiet skepticism to plant seeds of doubt inside the film's own moral framework, how Varang's history, including the detail that she killed her own father because she believed his weakness would lead to the clan's extinction, is not a character flaw but a theology. How the Forbes headline after the film's release, "Why Was Curie Ignored?" by Eywa, accidentally exposed the film's deepest wound. The evidence is hiding in plain sight. You've probably already seen it. You probably thought it was just plot mechanics. It's not. It never was. Watch what happens when you look again. The Monquan were Na'vi, full, complete, spiritually integrated Na'vi. They had their home tree, the sacred center of their community, the biological anchor of their connection to Eywa, the gathering place of their dead, their ancestors, their past. They had their cues, the neural interface that let them plug directly into Pandora's planetary consciousness, to commune with the Great Mother, to participate in the network of all life. They prayed. They maintained the balance. They did what Na'vi do. Then the volcano came. A volcanic eruption annihilated their home tree. Fire consumed their sacred land, their civilization. Thousands of years of accumulated spiritual practice, ecological knowledge, community memory was reduced to ash and stone and silence. People died. The land died. And through all of it, Eywa did not intervene. Critics and audiences process this as backstory. It's the villain's tragic origin, the event that explains why Varang is the way she is, the traumatic catalyst that transforms an ordinary Na'vi leader into an antagonist. This is such a standard genre convention that most viewers don't even register it as a choice. Of course, the villain has a sad backstory. That's what villains have. But think about what Cameron is actually saying with this origin. He is saying that the world of Pandora, the world governed by Eywa, the planetary consciousness that the franchise has positioned as the definition of ecological wisdom and moral authority, contains within it a region of volcanic devastation where Eywa's network is so weakened that the goddess either cannot or does not respond to the prayers of the devout. This is not the same as saying Eywa is absent everywhere. Eywa is clearly present and responsive in the forest territories. Kiri's direct communion with the goddess, her ability to call animals, to manipulate the natural world, to hear Eywa's voice, is documented and real. The Met-Kaina's ocean territories are thick with bioluminescent network activity. Eywa answers. Eywa intervenes. Eywa cares deeply and demonstrably about her favored communities. What Cameron is saying is that Eywa's care is geographically unequal. The volcanic wasteland where the Mongquan lived and continue to live, because they have nowhere else to go, is outside the zone of divine response. Whether this is because Eywa cannot extend her network into scorched earth, or because Eywa chooses not to, or because Eywa simply doesn't prioritize communities living in geological danger zones, the effect is identical. The Mongquan prayed and nothing came. That's not backstory. That's the film's first exhibit of evidence for its actual thesis. Here's the question nobody asks. Why did Eywa's network not exist in the Mongquan's territory before the eruption? The volcanic wasteland is Eywa's failure, not just the volcanoes. A planetary consciousness that could intervene in wars, that could call animals to battle, that could maintain the neural memories of every being that ever plugged into a tree? Why couldn't that consciousness warn a community that a volcano was about to destroy their home? Why couldn't it prepare them, relocate them, absorb their dead into its network in a way that preserved rather than annihilated? The film doesn't answer these questions. It doesn't need to. The silence is the answer. The Mongquan already drew the conclusion. They prayed for years. They got nothing. And then they stopped praying. Not because they were corrupt, not because they were seduced by power, not because they made a moral choice to reject goodness in favor of evil. They stopped praying because they ran out of evidence that prayer worked. Varang's declaration, "Your goddess has no dominion here," is therefore not a villain's boast. It's a scientific observation delivered with the bitterness of someone who tested the hypothesis for years before accepting the data. Your goddess has no dominion here. We checked 1,000 times while our home was burning. She wasn't there. She isn't here now. The network doesn't reach us. The trees don't answer. This proves the thesis. This is theological horror in its purest form. Not the horror of a monster, but the horror of realizing that the safety net you were promised doesn't cover your particular zip code. Here's the moment that everyone misreads. The Ashclan, as part of their ideology, their religion of fire and grief, cuts the neural cues of captured Na'vi. They sever the physical connection to Eywa. They take the biological antenna through which Na'vi commune with their goddess, and they cut it off. And audiences react to this with the appropriate horror. This is a violation, an atrocity, an irreversible spiritual amputation. The horror is real. The act is genuinely terrible, but watch what the film is doing with it, because there are two ways to read cue cutting, and the second one is the one that nobody discusses. The first reading, it's cruelty. The Ashclan, having lost their own connection to Eywa, want to deprive others of a connection they can no longer access. Sour grapes as spiritual violence. the powerful taking away from others what was taken from them. The second reading, it's mercy, or at least it's what mercy looks like when it curdles into philosophy. The Ashclan doesn't believe Eywa is worth connecting to. They have evidence, their own devastating, definitive evidence, that the connection to Eywa offers no protection when actual catastrophe arrives. From their perspective, cutting the queue liberates other Navi from a false dependency. It's an act of violent evangelism. We will show you the truth that Eywa won't protect you, and we will do it in the most direct way possible, by removing the biological infrastructure that keeps you hoping for a response that isn't coming. This doesn't make it right, but it makes it something far more interesting than simple cruelty. It makes it an ideological act, a theological argument delivered with a blade. Watch how the film frames Varang performing or overseeing this ritual. She doesn't do it with pleasure. The film doesn't give her the gleeful villainy of someone who enjoys destruction for its own sake. She does it with the gravity of someone performing a necessary and painful task. She does it the way a surgeon removes a diseased organ, with precision, with purpose, with the certainty of someone who has decided that the disease is worse than the amputation. That framing is not accidental. Cameron is asking you to sit with the discomfort of Varang's logic before you dismiss it, because her logic is internally consistent. Because if Eywa genuinely doesn't answer, if the network is genuinely silent in the Mangquan's territory, then the queue is a leash, not a lifeline. It keeps you hoping for a response that won't come. It keeps you in a posture of supplication to a power that has chosen not to help you. From Varang's perspective, cutting the queue isn't cruelty. It's education. The film's deepest horror is not that the Ashclan does terrible things. The film's deepest horror is that their theological framework, born from genuine abandonment and genuine suffering, produces a coherent argument that the film cannot simply dismiss. Varang isn't wrong about the facts. She's wrong about the remedy. But the facts, the silence, the fire, the ash, the years of unanswered prayer are real. This proves the thesis. The queue cutting is the Ashclan's theological manifesto, made physical, made irreversible, made impossible to ignore. This is the detail that most people gloss over, the biographical footnote that reveals everything. Varang killed her own father. The reason? She believed his weakness was leading the Mangquan toward extinction. In the aftermath of the volcanic eruption, with the community shattered and starving and faithless, her father's leadership was insufficient. He couldn't hold them together. He couldn't replace the spiritual infrastructure that Eywa's silence had destroyed. He couldn't find a new framework for survival. And so Varang, with the cold pragmatism of someone who has already survived the unthinkable, removed him and took over. Critics read this as confirmation of her villainy. Of course, the antagonist killed her father. Villains always have some monstrous act in their past that marks them as beyond redemption. It's a genre shorthand for, this person has gone too far. But look at what Varang was actually doing. She was doing what Eywa didn't do. She was choosing life over sentiment. She was making the hard decision that no deity had been willing to make on her community's behalf. When the volcano came, Eywa didn't make a difficult choice to protect one group over another. Eywa made no choice at all. Eywa was simply absent. And in that absence, her father was failing. His faith, or his exhausted, damaged remnant of faith, was insufficient to the crisis. And Varang, who had already internalized the lesson that waiting for divine intervention was a death sentence, acted. This is terrible. This is not heroic. This is not something to celebrate. But it is theologically coherent. If you accept Varang's premise that Eywa abandoned you, that no external divine power is coming to save your community, that survival is entirely the responsibility of the living, then removing an ineffective leader is not a sin. It's governance, brutal, unforgivable governance. But governance. The film gives Varang this history not to condemn her, but to complete her theology. She doesn't just believe Eywa is absent. She has built an entire moral framework around Eywa's absence, one in which the only power that matters is the power you build with your own hands, in which weakness is itself a kind of betrayal, in which the people who pray for salvation while doing nothing are complicit in their own destruction. You don't have to agree with this framework. You're not supposed to agree with it uncritically, but you are supposed to understand it. And once you understand it, once you trace it back to its origin in the volcanic silence where a community prayed and received nothing, you realize that fire and ash has given its primary antagonist a genuinely defensible philosophical position. That's theological horror. That's what makes Varang terrifying in a way that Quaritch never was. Quaritch is terrifying because he's dangerous. Varang is terrifying because she might be right. The contrast between Kiri and the Ashclan is the film's most explicit theological argument, and it's been hiding in full view since The Way of Water introduced Kiri's abilities. Kiri has a direct, personal, intimate relationship with Eywa. She calls the goddess Mother, not as metaphor, not as religious convention, but as a genuine description of her relationship. She was born from the avatar of Grace Augustine, who died connected to Eywa's network. She can manipulate the natural world in ways no other Na'vi can. She can hear the goddess. She can speak to the goddess. She can speak to the goddess. She can call animals, redirect ecological systems, commune with the dead. She is, as one analysis accurately describes her, a messianic figure, the chosen daughter of the divine, the one through whom Eywa's will is most directly expressed. Now put Kiri in the same film as Varang. Put the girl who calls Eywa mother in the same film as the woman whose community prayed to Eywa while their home burned and received no answer. Put Eywa's most intimate, most favored, most specially gifted child alongside Eywa's most definitively abandoned community. And then have Kiri's power, her direct communion with the divine, potentially be the force that transforms Spider's biology, enabling a human to breathe Pandoran air without a mask. Watch what that juxtaposition does to the film's theology. Eywa responds to Kiri. Eywa works through Kiri. Eywa's power flows through this particular girl, born under these particular circumstances, possessing these particular gifts. Meanwhile, in the volcanic wasteland, Eywa's network doesn't even extend far enough to whisper. The contrast is not subtle. The contrast is the point. The obvious objection, Kiri's gifts are just her character's special ability. This is fantasy. The chosen one narrative is standard genre. Not everything is theological commentary. Here's what that objection overlooks. Cameron chose to put these two stories in the same film. He chose to position Kiri's messianic intimacy with Eywa against the Ashclan's catastrophic divine abandonment in the same narrative space. The collision of those two realities, the beloved daughter and the forgotten community, generates a question. The film deliberately refuses to answer. Why her? Why not them? Why does Eywa have a messianic relationship with Kiri, but no relationship whatsoever with the Mongquan? What did the Mongquan do to deserve their volcanic destruction and Eywa's silence? What did Kiri do, beyond being born under unusual circumstances, to deserve divine intimacy? The film doesn't answer. Eywa doesn't answer. The silence where an answer should be is the film's most important theological statement. This proves the thesis. Kiri's messianic connection and the Ashclan's abandoned prayers are two sides of the same theological horror story. You're probably thinking Neytiri's rejection of Spider is about grief, not theology. She's traumatized. She's lost Nedium. She's not in the position to be a fair or rational parent. This is a character flaw, not a structural argument. You're half right. And being half right is exactly what makes the scene so important. Neytiri's rejection of Spider is personal, emotional, and rooted in genuine trauma. That's real. That's the surface. But watch what the film does with it structurally. Watch who Spider is and what Neytiri is doing. Spider is a human child who grew up among the Na'vi. He loves Pandora. He fights for Pandora. He risks his life for the Sully family repeatedly. He is, by every behavioral and spiritual metric, more Na'vi than many Na'vi. He is loyal. He is devoted. He prays at the trees. He bonds with the land. He does everything right. And Neytiri, under pressure, cuts the bond, decides that his biological humanity, the category he was born into, not anything he chose or did, makes him too risky, makes him not fully one of them, makes him, in the moment of crisis, expendable in a way that her biological children are not. The film makes clear this is wrong. It makes clear that Neytiri's choice is driven by grief-distorted thinking rather than genuine moral assessment. But it also, and this is the crucial move, makes clear that the logic Neytiri is using is the same logic that governs Eywa's selective mercy. Eywa protects the Metkaina. Eywa responds to the Omadakaya. Eywa works through Kiri. Eywa extends her network to the people who live within her reach, who maintain the balance within her existing territory. The Mangkwan, living in the volcanic badlands outside the reach of the network, don't qualify. They're too different. Their circumstances make them too dangerous to incorporate, too costly to include, too remote to prioritize. Neytiri, doing to Spider exactly what Eywa did to the Mangkwan, is Cameron's most explicit statement of the film's thesis. This isn't an accident of the plot. This is structural theology. The human character mirrors the divine character. The family drama is the cosmological drama at reduced scale. The film is showing you, in intimate close-up, the emotional reality of what divine abandonment feels like, and then asking you to look up and recognize where you've seen this structure before. Every detail confirms the thesis. Neytiri and Eywa make the same choice. Spider and the Mangkwan receive the same verdict. The film asks you to feel the injustice in one case and invites you to recognize the injustice in the other. Here is a character who gets almost no attention in the critical conversation about fire and ash, and who is doing some of the film's most important theological work. Lok doesn't pray to Eywa. Let me be precise about this. When Lok and Kiri visit the Tree of Souls, Lok doesn't participate in the communion. He watches Kiri pray from a distance. He is, according to documentation of his character, skeptical of Eywa's abilities. In The Way of Water, he explicitly says, "I don't think praying is going to do much against starships." This is remarkable. Lok is Jake Sully's son. He was born into the Na'vi community. He has access to the neural queue. He lives within Eywa's network every day. He has every structural advantage that the Mangkwan lack. He can connect if he wants to. And he has watched Eywa respond to Kiri, has witnessed the divine presence firsthand, has grown up in a world where the evidence for Eywa's existence is not abstract faith, but biological fact. And he still doesn't pray. Why? Because Lok has drawn a different conclusion from the available evidence than the rest of his family. He's looked at Eywa, the same Eywa who gave Kiri messianic gifts, the same Eywa who didn't save Nedium, the same Eywa who didn't save Nedium, the same Eywa who responds to some prayers and ignores others, and concluded that prayer is not the tool for the actual problems his family faces. Starships, colonial violence, RDA technology, real-world threats that require real-world responses. Lok is doing something that no other character in the franchise has done. He's applying critical scrutiny to Eywa from inside the community of believers. He doesn't reject Eywa with Varang's fury or the Mangkwan's theological fire. He simply, quietly, persistently, without drama, declines to orient his life around prayer to a deity whose intervention he has found unreliable. This is the film's most subtle piece of theological evidence, and it's the most devastating. Because Lok is not a villain. He's not corrupted or radicalized or consumed by grief. He's a young man with eyes open. He's watched his brother die. He's watched his family suffer. He's watched Kiri commune with a goddess who seems selectively attentive, and he's arrived at a position of quiet skepticism. Put Lok's quiet irreligion alongside Varang's furious apostasy. They're on the same spectrum. They started from the same observation, that Eywa's responses are selective, that divine attention is not distributed equally, that prayer is an unreliable instrument against genuine catastrophe. The difference is circumstance, not logic. Loic, living within Eywa's network, can afford quiet skepticism. Varang, living in the volcanic wasteland where the network is absent, had to build an entire alternative cosmology to survive. This proves the thesis. Loic is the film's internal witness, the voice within the chosen community that quietly testifies to the injustice of divine favoritism. This is the scene that nobody knows what to do with. Critics mentioned it in passing. Spider gains the ability to breathe Pandoran air without a mask due to a mycelium infection. The film apparently doesn't fully explain the mechanism. Fans speculated that Curie intervened using her connection to Eywa. Cameron himself described the subplot as something left unexplained that becomes a crucial turning point. Everyone treated it as a plot device, as a convenient story mechanism to raise the stakes. Because if Quaritch captures Spider and reverse engineers the biological change, humans could flood Pandora en masse, threatening the Navi's survival. But look at what's actually happening here. Not the plot mechanics, the theology. Spider is a human. He was born human. He cannot breathe Pandoran air. He has lived his entire life on this planet, has bonded with it more deeply than almost any other human, and the fundamental biological barrier remains. He is not, by the definition his biology imposes, of Pandora. And then Pandora, through the mycelium, through the biological network that is Eywa's physical substrate, changes his biology, incorporates him, absorbs him, makes him, on a molecular level, compatible with the world he already loves. The critical question, did Eywa do this? The answer is, possibly not. The mycelium is part of Pandora's biological system, but the film leaves the causation ambiguous. It may be Curie intervening. It may be the mycelium acting on its own biological logic. It may be something else entirely. The film doesn't say, and that ambiguity is the film's most profound theological statement. Because here's the thing about the mycelium transformation. It achieves something that Eywa, the conscious divine intelligence, never bothered to do for Spider. Eywa has been aware of Spider for his entire life. Eywa's network permeates every corner of the Navi community where Spider grew up. If any divine intelligence could have chosen to incorporate Spider, to officially, cosmologically welcome this loyal, devoted, clearly worthy human into the Pandoran family, it was Eywa, long before Fire and Ash. But Eywa didn't. Eywa maintained the biological division between human and Navi. Eywa kept Spider in the category of human, despite everything his behavior and his heart declared about his allegiance and his belonging. And then the mycelium, this distributed, decentralized biological system, operating according to its own logic, does what Eywa declined to do. It changes Spider. It incorporates him. It rewrites his biology to make official what was already spiritually true. This is Pandora acting outside Eywa's divine fiat. This is the planet's biological intelligence making a judgment that the goddess didn't make. And whether or not Curie was the instrument of this change, the fact that it happened, the fact that the biological substrate of Pandoran life was more inclusive than the divine consciousness built on top of it, is the film's most quietly radical theological claim. The planet is more generous than the goddess. The biology is more just than the deity. The mycelium didn't check whether Spider belonged before incorporating him. It just did it. Because he was there, and he was suffering, and the biological imperative to incorporate compatible life is broader than Eywa's chosen categories. This proves the thesis. Spider's transformation is Pandora making a theological statement that Eywa never made, and the film notices the difference even if it doesn't name it. After Fire and Ash opened, Forbes published a piece asking this specific question: why, at a crucial moment in the film, was Curie Eywa's most beloved daughter, the messianic figure through whom the goddess most directly works, ignored by Eywa? The article frames it as a narrative question, a story problem, a continuity issue. Why would the film position Curie as having a direct line to the divine and then show that line going temporarily dead? But the film's answer, insofar as it has one, is the most devastating piece of evidence for the theological horror thesis. Even Curie gets abandoned. Even the chosen one in certain moments extends her hand toward the divine and finds it empty. Even the Messianic figure, the girl born of grace, literally born from Grace Augustine, the one who calls Eywa mother and means it, even she has experienced the silence. This is not a plot hole. This is Cameron completing the theological argument. If Eywa abandoned the Mengquan, we can tell ourselves that it was because of geography. The network doesn't reach the volcanic wasteland. If Eywa failed to save Netium, we can tell ourselves that death is simply the limit of divine intervention. But if Eywa ignores Curie, if the goddess goes silent for even a moment toward the human she has most specifically, most intimately, most powerfully chosen, then the silence is not geographical. It's not about the network's reach. It's not about the limits of divine power. The silence is just what the divine sometimes does to everyone, even the beloved. Which means the Mengquan's experience was not exceptional. It was not a special case of divine absence limited to the geographically unfortunate. It was simply a more extreme, more permanent version of something every believer eventually experiences, the moment when the line goes dead, when the prayer echoes in empty air, when the goddess is simply not there. And the film's terrible implication is this: the difference between Curie and the Mengquan is not that Eywa loves one and abandoned the other. The difference is that Curie's silence was temporary, while the Mengquan's was forever. The difference is statistical, not theological. The Mengquan were simply the community for whom the temporary silence never ended. This is not a comfortable thing to sit with. This is theological horror. This changes everything about how you watch the Ashclan's ideology. Because now you understand that their theology isn't the product of exceptional divine cruelty toward them specifically. It's the product of a divine relationship that is, by nature, intermittent, and they had the catastrophic misfortune of their catastrophe coinciding with an interruption that never resolved. Let me do this properly. Let me give the opposition the best version of its case before I dismantle it. Because the three counter-arguments against the theological horror thesis are real. They're not straw men. They deserve serious engagement. The measure of a thesis is not whether it can dismiss weak objections, but whether it can survive strong ones. Here are the three strongest objections to the claim that Avatar, Fire and Ash is a horror film about divine abandonment. And here is exactly why each of them, despite its genuine merit, ultimately fails to defeat the thesis. This is the most substantive objection, and it comes from the most authoritative source. James Cameron, the writer and director of Fire and Ash, explicitly stated that grief is the thread connecting everyone in the film. The official review from But Why Though describes this as the film's central organizing principle. Grief is the thread connecting everyone. It connects the antagonists as much as the protagonists. Multiple analyses, multiple reviews, multiple interviews all point to the same conclusion. This is a film about grief. Cameron said so. Look, there's merit to this. The film is genuinely and profoundly about grief. Netium's death in the Way of Water left a wound in the Sully family that Fire and Ash anatomizes with real emotional intelligence. Jake's guilt, Neytiri's fractured relationship with Spider, Loke's traumatized dissociation. Viewers have noted that Loke shows symptoms of depersonalization, derealization disorder as he processes the violence around him. The Ash clan's grief over the volcanic destruction of their home. Even Quaritch, strange as it is to say, carries a kind of grief for the human life he used to have, the son he barely knows, the identity that was stripped from him by death and resurrection. The film takes grief seriously across every character, every faction, every relationship. But here's what the grief is. The theme. Reading overlooks grief requires something to grieve. You can only grieve a loss, and the specific loss that drives every significant character and faction in Fire and Ash is, in every case, a loss that could have been prevented by divine intervention and wasn't. Nadium's death, preventable if Eywa had intervened more decisively. The Monquan's destruction, preventable if Eywa's network had extended to the volcanic region, or if the goddess had warned them. Spider's estrangement from the family he loves, a wound Eywa could have healed by formally incorporating him into the biological community long ago. The grief in Fire and Ash is not generic grief. It is specifically and repeatedly grief at losses that the film's own theological framework should have been able to prevent. The film keeps asking, through its character choices, its thematic parallels, its structural repetitions, why these losses happen in a world governed by a conscious, loving, powerful divine intelligence. Cameron may have described the film as being about grief. Directors describe their films in reductive terms all the time, either because they're marketing or because the full complexity of what they've made exceeds what any single sentence can capture, or because the deepest intentions of a work are genuinely invisible even to its creator. Watch what the film actually does versus what it says it does. The film is about grief, yes. It's about grief that the theology should have been able to prevent and didn't. That's not grief as theme, that's grief as theological indictment. And the distinction matters enormously. The grief is the theme. Reading is correct but incomplete. It's the surface of the argument. The theological horror thesis is what lives underneath the grief, the structural reason why the specific losses in this film feel so particularly devastating. This is the critic's objection, and it has teeth. Comicbook.com directly stated that Fire and Ash completely fumbles Varang and the Ash people. Multiple reviews noted that despite their compelling backstory, the Ashclan receives insufficient screen time and character development for their ideology to fully land. Varang is introduced, positioned as a major antagonist, given a brief account of her origins, and then largely deployed as a plot obstacle rather than a fully realized character. Acknowledged. There's truth here. The critique that the Ashclan's theological complexity is underexplored given the film's runtime is fair. In a film that already runs 3 hours and 15 minutes, Cameron nonetheless chose to spend relatively limited time on Varang's internal world, her ideology, her relationship to the divine silence she's built her life around. Compared to the depth of focus on the Sully family dynamics, which consume the vast majority of the narrative, the Ashclan is, in terms of screen time, secondary. But here's what that critique overlooks. It measures the Ashclan by the wrong standard. The critics are saying the Ashclan should have been given a deeper, more comprehensive character breakdown. They wanted more scenes of Varang, more exploration of Manquan culture, more time inside the logic of their alternative theology. And they're not wrong to want that. More would have been better. The film's relative underdevelopment of the Ashclan's interiority is a genuine limitation, but the argument that the film's theological complexity is undermined by this underdevelopment assumes that you need comprehensive character coverage to embed a structural argument. You don't. The argument isn't in the dialogue. It isn't dependent on extended scenes of Varang explaining her theology. The argument is in the film's architecture, in the structural juxtaposition of Kiri's divine intimacy and the Manquan's divine silence, in the parallel between Neytiri's favoritism and Eywa's favoritism, in what the mycelium transformation implies about the relationship between biology and divinity. These structural elements work even if Varang only appears in 15 minutes of screen time. Cameron has planted the theological argument in the bones of the film, not in its character development. The Ashclan doesn't need to be comprehensively portrayed for their existence to pose the question that the film refuses to answer. Why them? Why did Eywa abandon them while choosing Kiri? Moreover, and this is the critical move, the underdevelopment of the Ashclan may itself be evidence for the thesis. In a world governed by Eywa's favoritism, those outside the network don't get fully told. Their stories are abbreviated. Their complexity is underserved. The structural marginalization of the Ashclan in the film's narrative mirrors the theological marginalization of the Ashclan in Eywa's network. The film's formal choice, giving the Mangkwan less screen time, less interiority, less comprehensive treatment, echoes the divine choice that created them in the first place. Whether this was intentional on Cameron's part is irrelevant. The formal rhyme is there. The argument holds. This is the objection that comes from a certain kind of film realism, the pragmatic view that Hollywood franchise blockbusters, by their commercial and structural nature, simply don't operate at the level of theological philosophy. They operate at the level of spectacle, character, entertainment. The Avatar franchise, in particular, has always been primary, a visual technology showcase, and secondarily a family adventure story. To claim it's doing theology is to project depth onto surface. There's validity here, too. Cameron is not Ingmar Bergman, Fire and Ash is not the Seventh Seal, Pandora is not a philosophical dialogue about the existence of God and the problem of suffering. Cameron's primary gifts are technical, visual storytelling, physical action, ecological world-building, not theological argumentation. But here's what this objection misses. Theology doesn't require intent. The problem of divine abandonment doesn't need a director to consciously set out to make a film about the problem of divine abandonment. It just requires a film that builds a world governed by a conscious, responsive, divine intelligence, introduces communities who have been failed by that intelligence, and asks audiences to sit with both realities simultaneously without resolving the contradiction. Cameron built exactly this structure. He created Eywa as a genuine divine intelligence, conscious, responsive, caring, powerful. He populated her world with communities of devout believers. And then he introduced, in the third film, a community of believers who received none of the divine response that other communities take for granted. He placed that community in direct narrative contact with the most divinely favored character in the franchise. You don't have to call it theology. You can call it world building with unresolved contradictions. You can call it character design that accidentally generates a problem of evil. You can call it whatever you want. But the structural argument, the question about why Eywa responds to some and not others, and what that does to the one she doesn't respond to, is in the film. It's in there whether Cameron intended it or not, and it is the most interesting thing the film is doing. It's just a blockbuster objection proves too much. The same argument would prevent us from finding the grief argument that Cameron himself endorses. If the film is too commercial for theology, it's too commercial for the deep emotional work around trauma and loss that every positive review celebrated. You can't have it both ways. If Fire and Ash is emotionally complex enough to be genuinely moving about grief, it is emotionally complex enough to be genuinely disturbing about the divine sources and causes of that grief. The theological horror thesis is not a projection. It's the most coherent framework for everything the film is actually doing. It's the argument that unifies the Ashclan's backstory, the Sully family dynamics, Spider's transformation, Loke's irreligion, and the Forbes question about Curie into a single, sustained, terrifying claim. Critics got Fire and Ash wrong because they measured it by franchise sequel standards. The film isn't asking, did the third one live up to the first two? The film is asking, does the goddess deserve her sovereignty? The answer is complicated. The argument is real. The theology is there. Avatar, Fire and Ash arrived in theaters on December 19, 2025. The timing matters more than you'd think. Not because Cameron planned it this way, though he might have, consciously or not, but because the film's deepest preoccupations arrived at the exact cultural moment when they would hit hardest. Let me tell you what was happening in December 2025. We were living through one of the most profound crises of institutional faith in modern history. Not just religious faith, though that too. Faith in institutions broadly. Faith in the idea that organized systems of authority and meaning, governments, churches, universities, scientific bodies, international organizations, actually work as advertised, actually respond when called upon, actually protect the communities they claim to serve. This crisis didn't begin in 2025. It accelerated through the pandemic years, when institutions worldwide failed their populations in ways ranging from genuinely unavoidable to shockingly preventable. It deepened through the subsequent years of political fragmentation as faith in democratic institutions corroded. It reached into religion with particular force as generations of abuse scandals, financial corruption, and doctrinal rigidity drove particularly young people away from organized religious practice at rates unprecedented in the modern era. Generation Z, the people who are Avatar's primary audience, who grew up with the franchise, who were children when Jake Sully was learning to fly in Ikran, is the least religious generation in American history. Not hostile to spirituality necessarily, not atheistic in any organized philosophical sense, simply disconnected, unwilling to commit to institutional frameworks that have failed to demonstrate their reliability. And here is what makes Fire and Ash so uncomfortably timely. It is, at its theological core, a film about exactly this experience, about praying to an organized system of meaning and receiving silence, about what a community does when the institution it organized its entire civilization around simply fails to show up at the moment of catastrophe, about whether the anger that follows justified abandonment is evil, or whether it is simply the rational response of people who ran out of reasons to keep faith. The Mangquan are not ancient history. The Mangquan are the parishioner who sent letters about abuse and was ignored. The Mangquan are the community that voted, organized, advocated, and watched their neighborhood demolished anyway. The Mangquan are the family that prayed at the hospital bed and got an empty room. The Mangquan are every community that did everything right by the institutional framework that governed their world and then watched that framework fail them at the exact moment it mattered most. Cameron did not set out to make a film about the 2025 crisis of institutional faith. He set out to make the third chapter in an epic science fiction franchise about blue aliens on a distant moon. But artists make their moments art, whether they intend to or not. And the myth Cameron constructed, the benevolent planetary consciousness that governs Pandora through favoritism and geographic selectivity, turned out to encode, with almost eerie precision, the structure of the institutional failure that was reshaping societies around the world as the film entered production. This is not coincidence. This is how mythology works. There is a concept in theology, one of the oldest and most intractable problems in religious philosophy, called the problem of evil. Its formal statement, if God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, why does evil exist? Why does suffering happen? Why do volcanoes destroy communities of devout believers while the goddess who governs that world stands silent? Philosophers have wrestled with this question for millennia. The responses are many and varied. The free will defense? God allows suffering because genuine freedom requires the possibility of real harm. The soul-making theodicy? Suffering builds character and moral depth. The greater good argument, individual suffering serves a larger cosmic purpose invisible to human perception, and the divine mystery position, God's ways are incomprehensible to finite minds, and the question itself is malformed. Avatar, Fire and Ash raises the problem of evil for Pandora and, crucially, refuses every conventional theodicy. The free will defense doesn't apply. A volcanic eruption isn't a free will event. Nobody chose to hurt the Mangquan. The volcano simply erupted. And Eywa, who demonstrably intervenes in Pandoran events when she chooses to, did not intervene. The soul-making theodicy collapses under the weight of the Ashclan's actual development. They didn't become morally greater through their suffering. They became, by the film's own framing, something darker, violent, territorial, destructive of others' spiritual connections. The suffering didn't refine them, it weaponized them. The greater good argument requires that we identify what greater good was served by Eywa's silence during the volcanic eruption. The film offers no such identification. No benefit to the broader Pandoran ecosystem from the Mangquan's destruction is visible. Their suffering serves no obvious larger purpose in Eywa's plan, and the divine mystery position that Eywa's ways are beyond comprehension is the one that the film actually deploys implicitly by refusing to answer the question at all. Eywa does not explain herself. The Mangquan receive no accounting for the silence. They simply live with it. Here's the critical point. Divine mystery. Theodicy is the weakest possible answer to the problem of evil because it is functionally indistinguishable from the absence of an answer. God works in mysterious ways, and God does not exist. Make identical predictions about the observable world of a community consumed by volcanic fire. If the goddess's ways are so mysterious that they cannot be distinguished from divine absence, then the Mangquan's theological conclusion that Eywa has no dominion in their territory is not a heresy. It's an empirically justifiable inference from available data. Cameron has built a world in which the problem of evil exists, placed the community at its epicenter, and then cast that community as the primary antagonist. The film's moral framework asks us to judge the Mangquan for their apostasy while never adequately accounting for the divine behavior that created their apostasy in the first place. That structural gap, the question the film raises but refuses to answer, is where the theological horror lives. There is a philosopher whose work speaks directly to what the Mangquan experienced, though she would never have imagined her framework applied to blue aliens on a distant moon. Simone Weil, the French philosopher, mystic, and activist who died in 1943, developed a theology of what she called waiting on God. The concept, true spiritual practice, is fundamentally receptive. You do not compel divine attention. You wait, you maintain the posture of availability. You tend the inner quiet in which divine presence might appear. And the waiting itself, the discipline of sustained openness, is the spiritual practice regardless of whether anything arrives. Weil experienced extended periods of what she called divine silence. The absence of felt divine presence, the continuation of spiritual discipline in conditions of no perceptible response. She interpreted this silence not as abandonment, but as an invitation to a deeper form of faithfulness, to trust the relationship when no evidence supports it, to maintain the posture of reception even when nothing arrives. It is a beautiful and demanding theology. It is also a theology that requires something the Mangquan didn't have. The luxury of sustained waiting. You can wait on God when your community is intact. You can maintain the posture of receptive silence when your home tree is standing and your people are fed and the network beneath your feet hums with connection. Weil's theology of waiting is the theology of someone who has enough structural stability to practice patience. What does waiting on God look like when the volcano comes, when everything burns? When the waiting period extends not through a mystical dark night of the soul, but through actual famine, actual homelessness, actual extinction pressure? Weil's theology doesn't have an answer for the Mangquan because Weil's theology was developed in conditions of relative physical safety. The Mangquan couldn't afford mystical waiting. They needed food. They needed shelter. They needed community survival. And in that context, the spiritual discipline of patient reception became, practically speaking, indistinguishable from slow death. This is the film's most painful insight about the relationship between faith and material conditions. The Sully family can afford to maintain faith in Eywa because they live within her network, because her presence is biologically real and continuously accessible to them, because their spiritual life is reinforced by daily evidence of divine presence. The Mangkwan could not maintain faith in Eywa because the material conditions of their existence, volcanic wasteland, broken network, constant survival pressure, removed every piece of supporting evidence one by one. Their apostasy is not a failure of spiritual will. It is the inevitable result of a faith practice stripped of all material and evidential support. Weil was right that deep faith can survive the absence of felt divine presence, but she was describing the experience of an individual mystic in stable material conditions. She was not describing the experience of a community in crisis. Cameron, whether he knows Simone Weil or not, has dramatized the limits of her theology. The Mangkwan are the answer to the question Weil never fully asked. What happens to the waiting when the waiting community is dying? James Cameron is not a conventionally religious man. He has spoken in various interviews about his own relationship with organized religion, cautious, skeptical, fundamentally oriented toward empiricism and scientific investigation rather than doctrinal faith. He has also spoken about his deep belief in something like ecological spirituality, the sense that the natural world contains intelligence and meaning beyond what human frameworks can fully capture. This biography matters for understanding Fire and Ash because it explains why Cameron's theology of Eywa is structurally peculiar. He's not a Christian filmmaker writing a Christian God into space. He's not working from a doctrinal framework that would give Eywa the attributes of a conventionally omnipotent deity. He built Eywa as a distributed biological consciousness, a neural network, a planetary internet, and emergent intelligence arising from the interconnection of all living things. This means Eywa's divinity is not supernatural in the conventional sense. Eywa is powerful, conscious, and responsive. But she is also bounded by physics, by geography, by the reach of the biological network. In volcanic wasteland, the network doesn't grow. The trees don't live. The biology that carries Eywa's consciousness doesn't exist. Eywa may not be absent from the Mangkwan's territory by choice. She may be absent by limitation. This is a crucial theological distinction. A conventionally omnipotent God who ignores the Mangkwan is guilty of cruelty or indifference. A distributed biological consciousness that literally cannot extend its network into volcanic terrain is guilty of something more complex, not cruelty, but structural injustice. Eywa's existence as a network-dependent intelligence means that communities living outside the network's geographic range are structurally disadvantaged by the very nature of what the goddess is, not by a choice to abandon them, but by the physics of how she exists. This distinction doesn't reduce the horror, it changes its character. It transforms the theological horror from God is cruel to the structure of divinity itself creates a class of the irredeemably abandoned, which is, if anything, more disturbing. You can imagine an unjust God changing her mind. You cannot imagine physics changing its mind. Cameron built a goddess who cannot help everyone because she is constituted by a biology that doesn't reach everywhere. And then he populated that goddess's world with communities who live outside the biology's reach. And then he called those communities villains. That's the film's deepest horror. Not that Eywa is bad, but that Eywa is limited in ways that her most devoted believers haven't fully reckoned with. And that the communities who live where those limitations bite hardest, have been left to process that reckoning alone. There is another framework through which the Mangkwan's trajectory makes devastating sense, and it comes not from theology, but from colonial studies. The concept of internalized oppression, the process by which colonized communities absorb the values and practices of the colonizer, turning colonial violence inward and then outward against other colonized communities, is one of the most documented dynamics in the literature on historical and ongoing colonialism. Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth identified this dynamic as one of colonialism's most insidious effects. The colonized denied the ability to direct their violence against the colonizer, redirect it against each other. The colonial system doesn't just extract resources, it warps the moral imagination of the communities it damages, turning victims into perpetrators. The Menquan are Pandoran Navi. They are not colonized by the RDA in the way the Omaticaya and Metcaina are, but they have experienced something structurally analogous to colonial abandonment. They were left outside the network, the system of connection, meaning, and survival by the planetary order. They were, in every meaningful sense, left to manage on their own in territory that the dominant framework of Pandoran civilization doesn't support. And what happened? They internalized some of the most destructive elements of that colonial experience. They cut cues. They do to other Navi what was done to them through geological accident. They destroy connections they cannot access. They export their abandonment to others. They are doing to the communities they raid what the structure of Pandoran reality did to them. This is not unique to the Navi. This dynamic is documented across colonial histories with terrible consistency. Communities that have experienced institutional abandonment, religious, governmental, social, frequently become the most dangerous threats to neighboring communities, not because they are inherently more violent, but because abandonment does something specific to the moral framework of survival. It removes the sense of collective responsibility that shared institutional membership normally provides. If you're outside the network's ethics don't govern you. You're operating by pure survival logic. Cameron, placing this dynamic in the context of Avatar's colonial commentary, is doing something sophisticated. The franchise's central antagonist has always been the RDA, the human corporate colonial structure extracting Pandoran resources. But Fire and Ash introduces a second order of colonial damage, the communities created when Pandoran institutions fail their own members. The RDA's colonial violence is direct, visible, and easy to name. Eywa's structural abandonment of the Menquan is indirect, invisible, and much harder to name, which is exactly why the film presents the Ashclan as the problem rather than as a symptom. The real problem is the system that left them outside the network. The Ashclan are what happens downstream when that system's failure is never addressed. Fire and Ash is not the first film to make horror out of divine silence. It joins a small, distinguished, and genuinely terrifying tradition of cinema about what happens to faith when the divine goes quiet. Martin Scorsese's Silence, 2016, is the obvious comparison, a film about Portuguese Jesuit missionaries in 17th century Japan who face incomprehensible suffering while God remains silent. The film culminates in the question every faith tradition eventually has to ask: is God's silence itself a kind of speech? Is the absence of divine response the divine response? The divine response? Scorsese never fully resolves this. He leaves it open as a wound. Paul Schrader's First Reformed 2017 goes further, positing a world in which divine absence has been so complete for so long that the devout minister at the center of the film begins to build an ideology of action to compensate for divine inaction. Toller doesn't turn to fire, he turns to ecological martyrdom. But the structural logic is identical to Varang's I prayed, the world continued to burn, so I will act. Paul Verhoeven's Benedetta, 2021, examines a figure whose genuine mystical experiences exist alongside the institutional corruption of the church that claims to mediate divinity, questioning whether the divine can be genuine even when its institutional infrastructure is rotten. Fire and Ash belongs in this tradition. It is a blockbuster doing the work of the art film, using spectacular surface entertainment to deliver a genuinely disturbing investigation of the relationship between faith, community, and divine response. Cameron's version differs from Scorsese's and Schrader's because it externalizes the divine. Eywa is literally real, literally conscious, literally present in the network, rather than leaving God's existence ambiguous. This makes the theological horror more specific and, in some ways, more disturbing. In silence, God might not exist. In fire and ash, God definitely exists. She just doesn't answer everyone. That's the version of divine silence that is hardest to accept. Not the possibility that there's no one there, but the certainty that there is someone there, and they chose not to answer your particular prayer. I want to be precise about the cultural moment one more time, because it matters for why this film's thesis resonates beyond its obvious commercial and entertainment dimensions. In December 2025, the world was processing roughly 15 years of sustained evidence that major institutions, political, religious, scientific, financial, did not reliably protect the communities they claimed to govern. The financial crisis, the pandemic, the climate emergency, slow-motion institutional response, the rolling revelations of abuse, corruption, and self-dealing within the Catholic Church, within evangelical Christianity, within political parties across the spectrum, within universities and hospitals and police forces, the failure, repeated and documented, of systems of meaning to actually function as promised. The response to these failures had taken many forms. Some communities doubled down on faith, maintaining institutional loyalty in the face of evidence against it. Some communities exited quietly, drifting away from organizations they could no longer trust without fully replacing them with anything. And some communities did something closer to what the Mangkwan did. They built alternative frameworks out of anger and grief and the determination to survive without the support systems that had abandoned them. The radicalization that has characterized political life in this period, across all political directions, follows the Mangkwan template with disturbing fidelity. Community, institutional abandonment, survival without the network, alternative theology constructed from the ruins, violence directed outward against communities still within the network. The cycle is everywhere once you name it. Cameron didn't set out to make a film about political radicalization or institutional failure. He set out to make a fantasy adventure with blue aliens. But artists make their moments art, and the Mangkwan story, told in December 2025, landed in a world that had been producing Mangkwans for over a decade. The question the film asks, whether those who were abandoned by the divine order deserve to be judged by the divine order's standards, is not an abstract philosophical puzzle. It's the most urgent political and social question of this historical moment. And Fire and Ash, despite its franchise blockbuster wrapping, is asking it more directly, more honestly, and more disturbingly than most of what passed for serious cinema in 2025. The theological horror thesis isn't just in the plot structure and the character dynamics. It's built into the film's technical language, into the choices Cameron and his team made about light, color, sound, blocking, and editing. These aren't decorative choices, they're argumentative ones. And once you know what the argument is, you can see exactly how every major visual and sonic decision in Fire and Ash serves it. This isn't the cinematography being impressive, though it is. This isn't the visual effects being groundbreaking, though they are. This is the film's technical vocabulary functioning as a theological proposition. Let me show you 3 specific choices that prove the argument. The bioluminescence is the argument, not decorative, argumentative. The franchise has established across 3 films a consistent visual vocabulary for Eywa's network and its presence in the world. When Eywa is active, engaged, and responding to what's happening, when the divine consciousness of Pandora is present in a scene, the world glows, the trees light up, the ground pulses with blue and purple luminescence. The network becomes visible as a physical phenomenon, turning Pandoran nature into something that looks like the inside of a living computer, or the surface of a bioluminescent ocean, or, in the film's own visual language, the neural connections of a god's mind made visible. This visual language creates a specific expectation. When the divine is present, the world looks a certain way. When Kiri communes with Eywa, the bioluminescence responds. When the Omatakaya pray at the Tree of Souls, the network lights up around them. When Eywa's power moves through the natural world, the camera shows it to you in blue and gold, and the deep luminous purple that the franchise has made synonymous with sacred contact. Now look at the Ashclan sequences. Look at their territory. Look at the visual palette of every scene in the Mongquan's world. It's dark. Not dark in the dramatic thriller sense. Dark in the specific, thematic, theologically precise sense that the bioluminescent network is absent. The Ashclan's environment is lit by fire, by volcanic glow, by harsh industrial-scale light that belongs to the same visual family as the RDA's technology, rather than to Pandora's organic radiance. The divine light isn't there. The network isn't visible. The blue-gold-purple of Eywa's presence has been replaced by orange-red-gray, the colors of burning and ash and geological violence. Most viewers registered this as visual design, as world building, as Cameron's team establishing the Ashclan's environment as distinct from the forest and ocean territories the franchise has explored before. They're right, but they're only half right. The visual design is world building and theological argument simultaneously. The Ashclan's territory looks different from the rest of Pandora because it is different, because the network doesn't reach it, because Eywa's presence doesn't extend there, because the divine light is genuinely absent from this landscape. The camera is showing you in every Ashclan scene what divine abandonment looks like. It looks like fire where there should be bioluminescence. It looks like the orange of volcanic heat replacing the blue of Eywa's consciousness. It looks like a world where the godlight has gone out, where the visual language of divine presence has been replaced by the visual language of geological violence. And then watch what happens when the film cuts between the Ashclan's environment and the environments inhabited by the Sully family or the Met Cayena. The transition is jarring, not because the production design made an inconsistent choice, but because it made a perfectly consistent one. You're moving between a world where God is present, luminous, blue, alive with connection, and a world where God is absent, dark, firelit, disconnected from the network. The visual grammar of divine presence is being used as theological argument. This proves the thesis in purely visual terms. You don't need to hear Varang say your goddess has no dominion here to understand the theological condition of the Ashclan's territory. The camera has already told you. The bioluminescence's absence is the film's most silent and most eloquent piece of evidence. The franchise's sonic language for Eywa's presence is as consistent and specific as its visual language. When Eywa is active, when the divine consciousness responds to prayer, when the network is engaged, when the sacred relationship between Navi and goddess is functioning, there is music. Specifically, there is choir. The choral arrangements that James Horner established in the original Avatar and that Simon Franklin developed further in The Way of Water function as the sonic signature of divine presence. When you hear the choir, Eywa is answering. This isn't incidental. It's a deliberate compositional choice that Cameron and his sound team have been consistent about across all three films. The choir is the sound of the sacred. The choir is the audio equivalent of the bioluminescence, the signal that something divine is present in the scene. Listen for the choir in the Ashclan sequences. It's not there. Every scene in Mongquan territory, every scene featuring Varang's ideology and the Ashclan's alternative theology, every scene of cue-cutting and fire-wielding and the dark emotional world of the abandoned community, none of them carry the choral signature. The soundtrack in these sequences is percussion-heavy, low register built around rhythm and tension rather than the soaring, transcendent harmonic language that accompanies Eywa's presence. The difference is not about genre conventions for hero versus villain scoring. The film isn't simply giving the villains ominous music while giving the heroes uplifting music. The difference is theologically specific. The Ashclan scenes are scored to signal the absence of the sacred, not the presence of menace. Compare this to Quaritch's sequences. Quaritch, the franchise's recurring human antagonist, does get villain scoring. His presence carries menace, urgency, threat. The music around Quaritch is about power and danger and the colonial violence he represents. Varang's music is different. It's not primarily about threat. It's about absence. The sound design in Mongquan sequences keeps reaching for something that isn't there. Rhythmic, insistent, organized around percussion that drives forward without the harmonic resolution that choir provides. It's the sonic experience of prayer without an answer, rhythm without resolution, devotion without resolution, devotion without response. This is astonishing craft, whether fully conscious or not. The sound designers have built Eywa's absence into the sonic texture of every Ashclan scene. You hear the silence where the choir should be. You hear a world where the sacred frequency is missing. You hear, in the very structure of the film soundtrack, the theological condition that created the Ashclan. The silence in the score is the silence in the prayer. The absent choir is the absent goddess, and you've been hearing the argument without knowing you were hearing it. This is the most granular piece of evidence, and it's the one that requires the most careful attention to specific staging choices. Cameron's blocking. The physical positioning of characters in the frame consistently uses the bioluminescent network's light as a theological indicator of characters' relationship to the divine. Characters who are within Eywa's network, who are in active spiritual relationship with the goddess, tend to be positioned so that the bioluminescent light falls on them. Characters who are outside the network, who have broken or never had that relationship, tend to be blocked in shadow, in firelight, in the absence of the blue-gold glow. The most specific version of this, look at how Varang is blocked in scenes that include both her and Navi, who are within Eywa's network. When Varang's blocking is described as creating a struggle for power, Cameron himself described the tenth scene with Quaritch as containing struggle for power and underlying sensuality. What he's not fully articulating is that the power struggle is, at the visual level, a struggle over where to stand in relation to the divine light. Characters who are within the network can be lit by it. Varang cannot. Wherever the network light falls, she's adjacent to it, not bathed in it. She is always visually in the adjacent shadow. This is not subtle. This is the camera showing you in every frame the spatial theology of Eywa's favoritism. Some characters live in the light. Varang lives at its edge. The blocking of Kiri is the exact inverse. In every scene where Kiri's connection to Eywa is active, which is most scenes involving her, the light falls on her specifically, particularly, almost supernaturally. She doesn't simply occupy lit space. The light seems to seek her out. The bioluminescent network responds to her physical presence in a way it doesn't respond to other characters. Put Varang's persistent adjacency to shadow and Kiri's persistent positioning in light in the same visual analysis, and you have the film's theological argument made purely in space and illumination. No dialogue required, no exposition needed. The blocking tells you everything about the moral geometry of divine favoritism, the chosen daughter in the light, the abandoned prophet in the shadow she never asked for. The craft element that consolidates this, in the rare moments when Varang is briefly lit by something other than fire or torchlight, when she's positioned near the network's edge, where a faint trace of bioluminescence might reach, she is, in those moments, visually beautiful in a way the film otherwise keeps carefully muted, as if the camera is showing you what Varang could have been, what she was before the volcano, what she might be if the light had simply fallen on her the way it falls on Kiri. Those brief moments are the film's most compassionate theological statement. They don't absolve Varang of the violence she's chosen, but they do ask you to grieve the alternative, the Varang who might have existed if Eywa's network had extended a little further into volcanic territory, if the light had simply reached. Spider's mycelium transformation has its own visual grammar, and it's the most radical piece of craft evidence in the film. When the mycelium works on Spider, when Pandora's distributed biological network begins changing his respiratory biology, the visual language is neither Eywa's bioluminescence nor the Ashclan's fire. It's something entirely different. It's organic, biological, cellular, the visual language of growth and transformation, of life systems adapting to new circumstances, of the planet's biochemistry following its own logic. This is the craft argument for the theological claim I made in Module 2 about the mycelium. The visual language of Spider's transformation doesn't belong to the divine. It belongs to the biological. It's not lit with the blue gold of Eywa's consciousness. It's not scored with the choral signature of divine response. It looks like what it is: cellular biology doing what cellular biology does, incorporating new material, adapting, expanding its definition of what belongs. The visual language of the mycelium transformation is pointedly not theological in the franchise's established aesthetic language. It doesn't look like prayer being answered. It looks like a biological process operating outside the divine framework, which is precisely the theological argument. Spider's incorporation into Pandoran biology didn't require Eywa's blessing. The planet's distributed biochemistry made the decision that the conscious deity did not make. When Cameron leaves the mechanism of this transformation ambiguous, when he declines to definitively attribute it to Kiri or to Eywa or to anything specifically divine, the visual language supports that ambiguity. The mycelium looks biological, not divine. The transformation's visual grammar is the grammar of nature, not the grammar of the sacred. This is, in the context of the film's established visual theology, a radical statement, the most important transformation in Fire and Ash, the change that will determine the franchise's future, that represents Pandora's most significant adaptation to the human presence, happens outside the divine visual vocabulary. It happens in the biological register, in the language of cellular adaptation and network expansion, in a visual space that belongs neither to Eywa's chosen luminescence nor to the Ashclan's rejected fire. The mycelium is a third option. It's what happens when the theology breaks down and the biology continues. It's Pandora, making decisions without its goddess, or in spite of her, because the biology runs deeper than the divine consensus. That's the film's most cinematically radical argument, and it's made entirely in the visual grammar of cell walls and fungal networks and the beautiful, terrifying democracy of biological life. Rewatch it now. Rewatch Avatar: Fire and Ash with the theological horror thesis in your mind. Watch the bioluminescence track Eywa's favoritism in real time. Listen for the choir that plays for Kiri and goes silent for Varang. Watch the light that falls on the chosen and the shadow that edges the abandoned. Watch Spider's transformation happen in the biological register, outside the divine visual vocabulary, Pandora making a decision the goddess never bothered to make. When you do, the film you've been watching, the franchise sequel critics called repetitive, the family grief story Cameron endorsed in interviews, the action-adventure that earned a middling 70% on Rotten Tomatoes, becomes something else, something more disturbing. Something that I would argue is the most honest film James Cameron has ever made, precisely because its deepest argument was apparently too disturbing to name out loud. The thesis, stated one final time with all the evidence behind it, Avatar: Fire and Ash is a theological horror film about divine abandonment. Eywa, the goddess, the planetary consciousness, The sacred heart of Pandoran civilization is not omnipresent, not impartial, and not fair. Her network is geographically limited in ways that structurally disadvantage communities in geological badlands. Her responsiveness is selective in ways that produce a class of the irredeemably unheard. Her favoritism, expressed in the biological gifts she gave Curie, in the network access she provides to forest and ocean peoples, but not to volcanic wasteland survivors, creates the conditions for exactly the radicalization she then calls evil. Varang is not a villain. She is a theologian. A brutal, violent, dangerous theologian who has built an ideology of fire on top of genuine evidence that the dominant theological framework failed her community, but a theologian nonetheless. Her apostasy is earned. Her anger is just, even when her actions are not. And the film's decision to deploy her as the primary antagonist, without adequately addressing the theological legitimacy of her position, is itself the most honest move in the film, because that's exactly what happens in the real world. The abandoned are judged by the standards of the system that abandoned them. The apostates are called evil by the institutions whose failure created the apostasy. The ones who stopped waiting for a God who never came are blamed for not waiting longer. The Ashclan is what you get when the waiting breaks, when the prayer goes unanswered for so long that the silence itself becomes the theological data. When the community that could afford to wait, that lives within the network, that receives the bioluminescent response, that has the choir in their scenes, calls the community that could not afford to wait morally deficient. This changes everything about the Avatar franchise. Not just Fire and Ash, everything. If Fire and Ash is the film that exposes Eywa's structural limitation and favoritism, then the first two films, which positioned Eywa as unambiguous moral authority, look different in retrospect. Not wrong, but incomplete, not lying, but telling only the part of the story that belongs to the favored. The original Avatar told Eywa's story from inside the network. Jake Sully arrives, earns the favor of the Omaticaya, prays at the Tree of Souls, receives a miraculous divine response that turns the tide of battle. Eywa answers. The animals charge. The RDA is defeated. The goddess, the network, the sacred connection between all living things. It works beautifully. But the original film told this story from the perspective of a community living within Eywa's reach. Of course Eywa worked for them. They were in the network. They were the chosen. The question the original Avatar never asked is, what was happening in the volcanic badlands during the Battle of the Hallelujah Mountains? What Na'vi communities lived outside the forest, outside Eywa's network, outside the bioluminescent architecture of divine response, and whether they prayed during the battle that Jake Sully's prayers decisively influenced. The Way of Water deepened the mythology and deepened the question. It introduced the Metkaina, an ocean people with their own version of the network, their own relationship with Eywa, their own sacred practices. And it introduced the killing of the Tolkun, the whale-like creatures who are spiritually connected to the Metkaina, as an ecological and spiritual atrocity. The RDA's violence against the Tolkun is framed as a crime not just against wildlife, but against the sacred. But even the Way of Water stayed within the network's reach. The Metkaina suffer, yes. Payakan is exiled and mourned, yes. But Eywa responds. The sacred is functional in the ocean as it was in the forest. The network holds. Fire and Ash is the third film, and it finally asks the question that the first two films made inevitable. What about the people for whom the network doesn't hold? The geological orphans, the theologically stranded, the Na'vi communities whose home trees burned not because of RDA colonialism, but because of tectonic forces that Eywa's network couldn't manage. Retroactively, this question haunts the franchise. How many other communities like the Mangkwan were there? In how many other volcanic regions? In how many other geological badlands? In how many other spaces outside Eywa's bioluminescent reach? Did Na'vi communities pray in catastrophe and receive silence? How many other Varangs were produced by Eywa's structural limitations before the franchise camera found the one who became an antagonist? The franchise, once you see it through the theological horror thesis, is the story of the chosen told from inside their chosenness, and Fire and Ash is the first crack in that comfortable perspective. Here is the audience argument, and it's the one that should be most uncomfortable. We watched the first Avatar and cheered when Eywa answered Jake's prayer and the animals charged. We watched The Way of Water and were moved by the Metkayina's spiritual relationship with the ocean and the Tulkun. We watched Fire and Ash and identified the Ashclan as the antagonist to be defeated. In other words, we have been, for 3 films, spectators at a feast who never noticed that some guests weren't invited. We've been sitting at the table of divine favor, watching through the eyes of characters who live within Eywa's network, who receive her bioluminescent responses, who hear the choir in their scenes, and experiencing that favor as simply the moral reality of the universe. Of course, Eywa answers Jake. Of course, Eywa works through Kiri. Of course, the network is real and sacred and worth fighting for. And then we watch the community that the network forgot march toward our protagonists with fire, and we called them the villains. We did what every comfortable majority does. When confronted with the anger of the abandoned, we evaluated their methods without examining the conditions that produced their method. We recoiled from the cue-cutting without sitting with the theological crisis that made cue-cutting feel, to the people doing it, like the only honest response to a false connection. We judged Varang by the standards of the network she no longer belongs to. The film asks us to do this. It positions the Ashclan as the threat to the Sully family's survival, which ensures our emotional investment is with the Sullys, which ensures we experience the Mongquan's aggression as pure antagonism. Cameron is very good at making you feel what he wants you to feel. He made you feel the Ashclan as a threat. But the architecture of the film, the theological horror embedded in its structure, asks a follow-up question that the emotional alignment of the narrative tries to suppress. What would you have become if the volcano had burned your home tree? What would you have concluded about Eywa if you had prayed through the fire and received silence? What theology would you have built in the ash? The film doesn't answer for you. It shouldn't. But it insists on asking, and the discomfort that many audiences felt after Fire and Ash, the sense that something about the Ashclan's defeat felt incomplete, that Varang's defeat felt like a loss rather than a victory, that the resolution was satisfying at the plot level but disturbing at some deeper level they couldn't quite name. That discomfort is the film working exactly as the theological horror thesis predicts. Because theological horror doesn't end with the monster's defeat. It ends with the question that the monster's existence posed, still unanswered, still relevant, still looking at you from the silence where the divine response should have been. I want to end with the most dangerous claim the thesis makes. Not the claim about the Ashclan, not the claim about Eywa's structural favoritism. The most radical implication of the theological horror thesis is what it says about the franchise's central narrative arc. Jake Sully's story, the human who becomes Na'vi, who earns Eywa's favor, who leads the resistance against colonial extraction, who is, by any narrative measure, the hero of the Avatar franchise, is, from the Ashclan's perspective, the story of how the network gained an even more powerful human champion while the volcanic badlands continued to be ignored. Jake's transformation from human to Na'vi didn't expand Eywa's reach into the geological wasteland. Jake's military leadership of the resistance against the RDA didn't address the structural conditions that leave communities like the Mongquan outside the network's range. Jake's deep and genuine love for Pandora, his commitment to the Na'vi way of life, his heroic resistance to colonialism. None of this changed anything for the people praying in the ash. The franchise celebrates Jake's arc as the definitive answer to colonialism on Pandora. And it is, for the communities within Eywa's network, for the Omaticaya and the Metkayina, Jake represents the possibility of the colonizer being redeemed, of the human presence being transformed rather than simply expelled. But the Mongquan didn't need the colonizer to be redeemed. They needed the network to reach their territory. They needed Eywa to answer when the volcano came. They needed something that Jake's heroic transformation, beautiful and genuinely admirable as it is, simply doesn't provide. Jake Sully is the hero of the story that Eywa's chosen communities are living. He is irrelevant to the story that the abandoned communities are living. And Fire and Ash, by placing both stories in the same film, makes this distinction visible for the first time. The franchise's hero doesn't fix the franchise's deepest problem. The franchise's deepest problem is structural. It's built into the geography of Eywa's network, into the physics of bioluminescent biology, into the fact that some communities live within the reach of the divine and some do not. Jake's heroism operates entirely within the system of divine favor. It doesn't challenge the system. It reinforces it by proving that even a human can be incorporated into Eywa's chosen network if he proves himself worthy. The Mongquan were worthy. They prayed, they maintained the balance, they did what the network asked of them, and the network still didn't reach them. Jake Sully is the story of how to earn Eywa's favor. Varang is the story of what happens when you can't. The franchise wants you to think Jake's story is the important one. Fire and Ash argues in its bones that Varang's story is the true one, the one that reveals what the franchise's governing mythology actually does to the people it leaves behind. Finish here, not with the summary. That's not what this argument needs. Finish with the thing the film is actually asking. Avatar, Fire and Ash is a horror film about what gods do to the abandoned, because what gods do to the abandoned is what institutions do to the abandoned, what governments do to the abandoned, what economies do to the abandoned, what every organized system of meaning and power does when it reaches its limits, which are always geographic, always material, always structural, always falling on someone. Somewhere in the world right now, a community is praying to an institution that has quietly stopped reaching them. Somewhere, a governing system that works beautifully for communities within its network is generating ash and fire in the geological badlands at its edges. Somewhere, people who did everything right by the framework of their civilization are discovering that the framework doesn't extend to their particular coordinates. They will not look like Varang. They will not wield fire and cut cues. They will look like ordinary people processing an extraordinary abandonment. But the theological logic will be the same. We prayed, and the silence was the answer. We waited, and the wait became its own verdict. We did what was asked of us, and the system moved on. What Cameron made inside 3 hours and 15 minutes of breathtaking visual technology, inside the Sully family's grief and survival, inside Spider's mycelium transformation, and Loke's quiet irreligion, and Kiri's messianic luminescence, and Varang's volcanic theology, is a film about that community, about what we owe them, about whether the judgment we render on their anger is fair, about whether the choir that plays in our scenes and the bioluminescence that lights our prayers gives us the moral authority we think it does. The Ashclan was abandoned by Eywa. The question Fire and Ash is asking, the one hiding behind the franchise spectacle, the one encoded in the visual grammar and the absent choir and the shadow that always edges Varang's frame, is whether we can say, with straight faces and clean consciences, that Eywa was right. I can't. And once you see this film clearly, I don't think you can either. Rewatch it. Look for what the bioluminescence avoids. Listen for the choir that doesn't play. Watch the shadow find Varang in every frame. Count how many times the camera shows you the fire where the blue light should be. The theological horror is in there. It was always in there. It was built into the film's bones, in the craft, in the structure, in the terrible parallel between Neytiri's favoritism and the goddesses, in Spider's transformation happening in the biological rather than the divine register, in Loke's quiet refusal to pray to something he knows is selective, in Kiri's luminous connection that throws the Mongquan silence into sharper relief, the brighter it burns. Avatar, Fire and Ash is not repetitive. It's relentless. There's a difference. The first two films showed you the network. The third one showed you what lives outside it. Now you can't unsee either.